Thanks for choosing this free Anfield Index podcast. If you'd prefer to listen to this or any of our other shows without adverts, then now's the time to check out Anfield Index Pro. With AI Pro, you can supercharge your entire listening experience. You'll not only get all of our podcasts without the ads, but you'll have them far faster with our quick publish feature available exclusively for subscribers. AI Pro also puts you in the heart of our sound studio, with an option to listen to many of our shows live and interact with the podcasters in real time as the shows are recording. Upgrading couldn't be easier. AI Pro is available on all popular podcast platforms, and we have our own apps for Apple and Android. Just head on over to AnfieldIndexPro.com and get started today.
Hello everyone, Rival Recon here on Anfield Index Pro. The Reds' ruthless machine continues to roll on as we enter the final 7 games of the season, with Klopp's side still in with a chance of winning an unprecedented quadruple. After a tough-fought draw against City in the league, followed up by a big win against them in the FA Cup semi-final on the weekend, on today's pod, our attention shifts towards Tuesday's game against a ragged-looking Manchester United side, who seem to be wishing the season to come to an early end. Joining me on the pod to give us his insight into what's been an acrimonious season for the Red Devils, we welcome back Richard Can from the Red Voices podcast. Welcome back, Rich.
Hi, how are you doing?
Not bad. We were just having a bit of chat before the pod there around sort of bank holiday weekend plans and things like that. But in terms of the number of things that we got to talk about on today's pod, considering the last time we spoke ahead of sort of the away version of this fixture, and then what transpired in that game, let alone sort of the season as a whole, I feel like there's plenty to talk about. There was plenty before that game as well, but I mean, I suppose that's probably an unpleasant and good place to start in terms of sort of that the game. I remember you weren't looking forward to it, basically, based on what you'd seen so far from United. I think the Leicester defeat was sort of reasonably fresh in the mind, even despite that win over at Atalanta. I suppose just getting your thoughts on how that game went, not just the result, but just sort of the nature of the performance, and then. We'll eventually get to Solskjaer, but just sort of your thoughts on the aftermath of that, because it felt like it was a seismic result, but then there wasn't necessarily any sort of immediate action following it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the performance and the result wasn't a surprise at all. United have been absolutely dreadful all, considerably more dreadful than they've been at any point in the last, whatever it is, 7 or 8 years since Fergie retired. The defending was appalling. There was no obvious structure to the team. I think the principal issue that Solskjaer had at the start of the season, at least, is that his first 2 seasons he built this side which was essentially based on counter-attacking. And so he had become reasonably proficient to that, and he had his kind of forward players, the players that need to be firing for that to happen, kind of Rashford and Fernandes, and to a degree Pogba and 1 or 2 others, actually in good form. And so United were able to get away with it in that second place finish. But then if you spend 80 million on Jadon Sancho and you bring in Rafael Varane, and then ultimately Cristiano Ronaldo, it's not going to be acceptable that you're playing relatively conservative counter-attacking football.
Yeah.
And Ronaldo in particular isn't appropriate for that. And I think Solskjaer realised there was this imperative to be more expansive. But unfortunately, I think what that did was expose the significantly weak areas in the team. And the Ronaldo signing in particular was and remains a really big problem as well. And I think he just exposed the sort of mishmash of players that United have signed over the last few years, and how they don't really fit together in any kind of functioning system, and the players that were bought for one system can't play another. So, Solskjaer paid 80 million for Harry Maguire, who was reasonably adept at playing as a defender in a kind of counter-attacking system, because he doesn't need his pace. You sit reasonably deep. and you're defending the penalty area. Whereas as soon as you try and play more expansively and your defence needs to push up the pitch, that's exactly the areas where he gets exposed. And I think it also exposed the relatively poor quality of the fullbacks, and just the midfield in particular. I mean, United went into the season with essentially one holding midfielder, and he's 34, and his legs have been falling off for about 3 years. So I think just all those things came together to completely expose the sort of ridiculous makeup of the United squad and the way that it's not really fit for anything. And I think that's been exposed even further with Rangnick coming in, bringing the coach with a very definite style of how his team should play, and he just doesn't have the personnel to carry it out. And I think as well, I mean, I'm sure there was something similar that sort of happened with Liverpool in the kind of lean years, in that they've been such a great team and such a great club that there's always an enormous pressure there to get back to the top.
Of course.
And when that doesn't happen, or if things turn, it's very difficult to turn that ship around, and confidence and pressure grows kind of exponentially, which I think you kind of saw to a degree in Rodgers' third season, I would have said. You'd come so close that season. But then when things didn't start going quite as well the following season, confidence can drop so quickly. And I think Liverpool were coming up at Old Trafford, coming up against a team that had just completely gone mentally. It was a tactical mess. And you had the other issue, which I don't think many of us really recognised at the time, which was that Solskjaer had maintained a huge squad, or built a huge squad, and had held on to players and promised them minutes, and then over the previous 18 months just didn't play them, regardless of how poor the guys were in front. So you had a situation where probably 2/3 of the squad were fuming and wanted to leave. And
who are you referring to there?
That still remains the case now. And I think once you lose the dressing room, once the confidence is drained out of a team, once the pressure's ramped up, then you get a performance like United put in at home to Liverpool, where you could see you were a team at the very top of its game playing against a team that was completely and utterly lost.
Yeah, and I think the thing for me watching that game, and it was an interesting one to watch, because it's always one, especially as I've been growing up as well, and as long as I've been following Liverpool, it was one that I didn't necessarily look forward to many difficult afternoons away at Old Trafford, irrespective of how Liverpool were playing, how their form was. We were going into it playing really, really well. All of a sudden, we even under Klopp as well, it appeared to be one of these fixtures where, on occasion, Guardiola's often criticised for overthinking, and if you were ever going to level that at Klopp, this seemed to be the game where, on occasion, along with the Merseyside derby sometimes, actually early on, where it seemed to be overthinking the occasion a little bit, and then we would the plan that had worked so well before and after that game just seemed to be abandoned on the day. So that was kind of an interesting thing. Yeah. But for me, watching it, I mean, there are obviously sort of a number of really strong individual performances on the Liverpool side. I think Naby Keita in particular was really good that day as well, despite Mo being sort of as sharp as he was at that stage of the season. But I think the most obvious thing to me was what you were alluding to there, basically the one club and the coherence of the planning that's gone on at that club, and then another club where you could talk about the off-pitch stuff, I'm sure, for a long time as well, but on the pitch as well, like you were saying, there didn't appear to be a plan that there was much confidence in, I'd say, in terms of sort of the approach they were taking. I remember the early moments of that game when Man United attempted to press Liverpool, but of course trying to do that when it's still not necessarily a tactic that you've got the players to implement properly, nor you're super comfortable with as well. So when a team plays round you, that can be incredibly unsettling. And we saw what happened with the defence as well, like you were mentioning. when they weren't deeper, dragged out of position, and of course it's a painful place to be. Certainly where Liverpool were at that stage, I think obviously sort of the forwards have gone in different sort of periods of form this season, and now we look at Salah, and Salah's in a relatively sort of dry patch for himself, whereas Mane's stepped forward, but on that day, he was particularly ruthless. I'm interested in what you were talking about beforehand in terms of, in these big games, Solskjaer did appear to have a formula, that more conservative approach where he'd sit and then look to counter, and had great success in some of these bigger encounters. Actually, it was some of the other games where United had issues under Solskjaer more often than not. But in these bigger games, he actually pulled off a number of really good results. From what you were saying to me there, you could sort of get away with still maintaining that approach until you sign Cristiano Ronaldo. Like even the other signings you mentioned with Sancho, with Varane, those are statement signings. I think people do expect more. But I'm interested in hearing your opinion, because we probably should speak about him as well, just as we're on that section. Just how unsettling a signing has that been, and sort of where do you sit on it at the moment? Because obviously there have been good moments for him, probably individually, that have sort of led to great late comebacks or sort of great moments to watch as a United fan. But where do you currently sit on that signing? And was that probably just one step too far for Solskjaer to sort of deal with, really?
Yeah, I think it felt at the time, although there was a lot of sort of emotion around it, and you love to see you kind of most beloved players come back to your club later in their careers. It felt like a mistake in terms of the team building and the structure of the team. It felt like a move which was going to put an awful lot more pressure on Solskjaer, and it felt like one which meant that, I mean, if you think he United had opened the season up with Mason Greenwood up front and sort of blown leads away. Now Solskjaer's United regularly blew leads away, but the nature of the performance with a really mobile forward like Greenwood was really promising. But as soon as you got Ronaldo in, and I know a lot of the analysis looks at the games where he excels, such as at the weekend. But for every game that he's really taken hold of it and dragged United through, there have been 3 or 4 where he's done next to nothing. And part of the issue is that he doesn't hold the ball up. He's not particularly good linking play. He can't press, and everything has to kind of revolve around where he is. And if he's not doing his job, then nothing works. And I think that's been a significant problem, and it has meant that United just had to throw away that counter-attacking style altogether, push everyone further up the pitch, because Ronaldo simply couldn't play from deep and be running 30, 40, 50 yards in every attack to kind of get on the end of things. And I think it just kind of tipped the balance. But I mean, if you look at it as a whole from now, this season was going to be a disaster regardless. I mean, if we'd started the season with Greenwood up front, then come whatever it was, late January, he's arrested and he's not there anyway. And we didn't have any sort of really alternative forward, given that Cavani basically decided he doesn't want to play football this year. But again, that's all kind of epitomises the state that United are in, that they found themselves with two forwards over the age of 34, and that one of which hasn't been available all season, and kind of the young guy they started with up front ended up getting pushed right again, just to fit in Ronaldo, so that we could have this feel good factor and sell some shirts. And that's really the way that United have operated for the last 7 or 8 years. It's really not thinking about the thinking about the whole and focusing on individuals. And so you have a team, and you've had a team for the last 3 years where good results are built on good individuals doing individual things. Whether it's Bruno or whether it's been Ronaldo this season or Rashford when he was in better form or whatever else, it's not about the strength of the collective. And then bringing Rangnick in when they did, it felt like a good move at the time because I do like him, but the reality is United don't remotely have the squad capable of playing the football that he wants to play. And yeah, I think Ronaldo just exposed the ridiculousness of the whole approach to squad building that's been the case for 7 or 8 years, and you ultimately end up with a squad which has essentially been built by a club whose director of football for the last 7 years was a banker. I mean, that sums it up really. It looks like a squad that's been assembled by a banker, and it looks like managerial choices that have been made by a banker. And that's, Ronaldo, I suppose, absolutely epitomises that. It was a name, and there was no thought about how he was going to fit into the structure as a whole, what it would mean for other players. And, as we say, we've had these moments, and to a degree, you could say United are where they are because of sort of performances that Ronaldo's put in individual games in the last 2 or 3 months. But there were so many games, there have been so many games where he's been absolutely hopeless. And as a result, the team just doesn't function. And what you've had all season is a team, I would say, on performance. I don't think there's been one genuinely good performance since the opening day. And every game just comes down to can those individuals score more goals than we let in at the other end? And that's that ultimately, Rangnick's been unable to change that because he just doesn't have the personnel to do it.
Yeah, I mean, just before we get on to Rangnick, I think it's obviously important that we talk about him and sort of the nature of his position as sort of interim manager. His very pronounced sort of thoughts about how a team should play his time away from the game in terms of actually being involved directly in coaching, things like that. But in terms of Solskjaer's sort of the end of his time at United, I remember speaking to you and plenty of other United fans as well who held a great deal of affection towards Solskjaer for a lot of the work, and there was a lot of work that he did whilst he was at the club. You can talk about sort of whether or not you thought there were actually the team was necessarily heading anywhere in terms of a long-term evolution or things like that, but in terms of some of the work that he did, integrating certain other players, I'm loath to say the phrase "steady the ship" at times, but sort of there were moments where it seemed as though things were functioning pretty well for him, despite I think you could always tell he was going to come up a little bit short against some of the elite managers in the league. Following a defeat like that, 5-0 at home to Liverpool, it felt seismic in terms of not only the result, the performance, we've spoken about that, but the fact that it was Liverpool at home. And so I must admit, I was very surprised that he lasted after that. And you might think that, maybe it would have been a very reactionary thing to do and sort of cruel thing to do to dismiss him after that. In the end, he lasts, I think it's 3, 4, maybe 5 games further than that, and is obviously sort of sacked following that defeat to Watford. Just your thoughts on sort of the sacking of Solskjaer in the end, the fact that it didn't come after sort of what felt like a pretty seismic result in that, and that he was allowed to sort of drift on a little bit further before Watford really did feel like it was just there was just nothing to redeem at that point. But I would just love your thoughts and sort of the thoughts of those you've been speaking to amongst United fans as to sort of how he was allowed to sort of drift on a little bit, and it did feel almost cruel at the end, sort of the way in which it was handled, even the interview he gave and things like that. So your thoughts on Solskjaer's end, basically.
I think in terms of winning matches and results, at the time I felt that it had been left too long. But with hindsight, I don't think it would have mattered when it happened, because the fundamental flaws in the team and in the morale in the dressing room were already there. They were already terminal for the season. I think that the wider point is, as you say, the fact that you know that he really did love the club, and every result hurt him personally, and the way things were going was hurting him personally, and to a degree it was cruel to leave him like that, feeling responsible for the mess that the team was in. So we then had the defeat at home to City, which was only 2-0, but frankly could have been worse than the Liverpool game if City had really been ruthless in that match. And I think after the Watford defeat, they had to pull the trigger, but they were completely unprepared for it, because that's what United do. I think 3 or 4 weeks before he'd only signed a new contract relatively soon before that Liverpool defeat, an unnecessary contract. He didn't need to have been given a new contract then. There was absolutely no danger of Ole Solskjaer going, no, I'm letting his contract run down, and then going, no, I'm not going to continue here if he was wanted. So it was just a completely pointless new contract, and yeah, it just dragged him through the mud. I think he was a guy who, I think you were talking about what he'd achieved at United, and ultimately, while it was all fundamentally flawed, and while I don't think he was qualified as a coach to really take on the club and the group of players, he did ultimately finish third and second in his 2 full seasons with squads that weren't the third and the second best squads in the league that season. So he did outperform really the quality in the squad for those 2 years, but it was just fundamentally flawed. And once all those things sort of turned against him, it was really cruel just to drag it on for so long. But it was the case that they were doing that because they had no plan. Ultimately, it made sense to sack him at the start of an international window that at least gave them 2 weeks to try and get some ducks in a row. But as it was, you could tell they were just winging it. And so it still took, I think, the best part of nearly 2 weeks for United to actually appoint anybody. So it was just a cruel way to go. You look back at a manager like Mourinho, gone before that, and frankly, I couldn't give a toss about his feelings. He didn't care about anything else apart from himself. But Solskjaer, you can understand that. It's like Steven Gerrard seeing Liverpool dragged through the mud on his watch, and being sort of just left there to take it. It would, just been equally cruel, wouldn't it? So yeah, it wasn't a good time for him. But again, it's just indicative of the state that United have been in for nearly a decade, and also the way they operate, which is always, without exception, reactionary rather than proactive.
And so, in terms of sort of reactions, then, and you mentioned it took almost a fortnight. Then Ralf Rangnick is appointed as sort of an interim manager, and there's lots of discussion in the early stages around sort of the breadth of his role, the fact that he's going to be sort of here in sort of a managerial capacity for a certain period of time to the end of the season, but then we'll also have the option, I think it was, to stay on as a consultant and be involved with off-pitch matters and maybe some of those factors rather that have been missing at United for so many years, right? In terms of sort of a football infrastructure perspective, the areas in which Rangnick had actually been most successful in sort of the recent years of his career, loads was made of that, and it's sort of interesting sort of seeing where we are now, because the impression I get actually right now ahead of the Liverpool game is that he doesn't appear to be speaking as a figure who seems as though he's going to be involved in the long-term sort of runnings and machinations of the club moving forward. But yeah, it'd be good to get your opinion on that as well. But at the time, as you mentioned, whoever came in, they were going to have to deal with a squad that had serious shortcomings. Whoever came in, I'm sure, would bring their own particular style of football, unless they were the ultimate pragmatists. And I know people were throwing around the name Antonio Conte plenty of times as well, prior to him being sort of appointed as Tottenham manager. And he's known for being somewhat more pragmatic when he needs to be, and has dealt with some of those situations. But whoever came in was going to have to deal with a lot of compromising. What did you make of the appointment when you first heard about it, and a little bit around sort of the supposed breadth of his role? And yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your your perspective on sort of where you think that stands at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the appointment, I was relatively pleased with it. I'm a fan of Rangnick's work, and it was really the first coach beyond Louis van Gaal that we'd had at United that really had a definitive sort of coaching philosophy that that we could actually, that might give the team some degree of identity. I think with hindsight, it doesn't matter who'd come in, they were all doomed from that moment. I absolutely no issue with United bringing in an interim manager. There was a lot of pressure at the time to just go for Conte or whoever and bring that manager in, and that's something that United may have done in the past. That they've quite often gone for the available guy who's free, even if they aren't necessarily a smart pick for the squad or for the role at that particular time. So that that's been the case with Moyes and with Van Gaal and with Mourinho. So I think the idea of actually waiting and getting the right coach in the summer wasn't a bad one, and I think with hindsight the season was already a bust. But then whatever intentions Rangnick had once he came in were pretty much moot when I think the scale of what he was dealing with became apparent. He tried to instigate a pressing system, which they achieved for about half an hour against Crystal Palace at home in his first match before he realised the squad wasn't physically capable of doing it. You can't have Bruno Fernandes and Paul Pogba and Cristiano Ronaldo in a team that tries to press, because two of them can't do it and the other one is just a tactical disaster and it will press everywhere rather than the area where he's supposed to. And so it's just really been a case of pragmatism since then. But if you then think that almost immediately Rangnick lost Greenwood to his arrest, and Cavani's never been fit, Varane's been fit half the time, and it became apparent that a large portion of the squad was so angry and so disenchanted he'd actually have to weaken the squad in January. So letting Donny van de Beek and Anthony Martial particularly go on loan almost immediately. Martial had played a key role in the winning goal against West Ham at Old Trafford the previous week, and then he as a substitute as well, and then he was immediately allowed to go on loan to Sevilla because he just had enough. And the same with Donny van de Beek and a couple of others. So he was, Rangnick taking over them was the biggest hospital pass in the history of Premier League football. I think he had. Yeah. It was just a bomb site, an absolute bomb site.
And he didn't mince his words either, did he? I think that's been one of the things I've wouldn't say enjoyed, but I mean it's enjoyable to see a manager who's not going to try and sugarcoat the situation. I'm sure it must be that way for you guys, sort of being aware of what's been going on. But when there were those issues in the dressing room, like you mentioned, he seemed pretty straightforward, but just coming out and telling it how it was. Or was that wrong?
Yeah. No, I really like that. I mean, that's one of the things I like most about Rangnick. He could he's very German in that he's very direct.
Yeah.
There's not a great deal of emotional analysis to it. It's this is the state of play. This is it, and this is what we've got to try and do to put it right. And I like that because we'd had Solskjaer, who in public would always talk as if everything was perfect, which was really his approach from the very beginning. It was just to say everything's rosy in public and then let loose in private if you needed to. You had Mourinho, for whom literally everything that came out of his mouth was some sort of divisive Machiavellian plan, and it's just been really nice to see a coach come in and just say, look, these are the problems. These are the problems we've got. This is why this isn't working. This is what we're trying to do. And I think he's been more free to do that because he's been an interim as well. So there's no long-term imperative on him to particularly keep players on side in any sort of long-term sense in terms of relationships. And so he's just been able to come in and say this is what's wrong, and that's kind of indicative of the kind of guy he is. I mean, ultimately he's been a technical director or a director of football for much of the last decade. And so you could see he's looking at the squad and thinking, this is what this squad needs. This is what it's lacking. This is what you'd need to do to make it better. As you were suggesting earlier, the question is, how much influence will he actually have on that in this consultancy role? I suspect that the way he's talked about it, he's basically been saying, I'm not going to talk about that because I've got an immediate job now, and we've got to focus on that. And I think that's absolutely fair enough. But I refuse to believe that he hasn't had some input in employing Erik Ten Hag, because Pochettino's been the dream of United's executives for since before he left Spurs. And so for United to move away from him, I think there needed to be some kind of input from outside the club. And I think Rangnick's been able to come in with a completely fresh eye. There's no emotional link to United per se, and he's just been able to say, this is what I think you need to do, this is who I think you need to do it. And for the first time, it looks like United are going to employ a coach with a very definite style, but also one who's on the up rather than one who's hit the downslope several years before. So I'd be very surprised if he has no input going forward. And United have started to build the beginnings of a recruitment structure with the appointment of John Murtagh as director of football, and he's a guy who is kind of untested at this level of the job, but he was previously head of recruitment for the women's team and the academy as well, and did a really excellent job in both of those roles, and actually formed relationships with an awful lot of clubs that he should be able to use going forward. The question is just how that new structure is going to work in practice, how much Erik Ten Hag will be involved in that, and how much of this is a long-term plan. Are United now looking to sort of play an Erik Ten Hag version of football as their ongoing sort of stake going forward, or is this just another, we're going to appoint this coach, we'll buy in players that fit his role, and if it goes wrong, we'll sack him and employ somebody else altogether with a completely different approach. So we really don't know how all of this is going to work out. But I do think for United to even think about the idea of Rangnick coming in to give them some advice shows a degree of insight that what you've been doing has been pretty disastrous, and that they need to do something else to try and correct that. So I have some degree of optimism, though, with this United. We all seem to manage to sabotage everything at some point along the way. I think the other important thing is as well that now that Ed Woodward's moved on, who was a guy who very much enjoyed the limelight, really, he was a big ego, and he enjoyed being involved in all of this stuff. Whereas
never heard of him actually. Never heard of that. it was
no. Whereas the impression that I get of Richard Arnold, who's taken over, is very different in that I don't think he's that interested in football. I think he recognises that his role is, or his skills are, commercial, and that's why he's wanting to delegate football decisions to football people. And so I'm hoping that there's a bit more of an acceptance that you need that expertise, but it's taken 10 years to even begin to recruit some degree of footballing expertise in the recruitment department, which has done untold damage in the meantime.
Yeah, no, it's pretty staggering considering sort of the size of the club and sort of the legacy that was obviously being followed on from. I think, throughout everything you've been saying throughout the pod, actually, I'm trying to think of some of the parallels between where Liverpool were sort of on their journey to appointing Klopp, getting the footballing infrastructure just right as well. And I think where we are now, I think coherence is probably the best word for it in terms of, as you mentioned there, people in their jobs doing the jobs that they are hired to do, so working in tandem, people not conspiring to sort of undercut somebody from another room. Obviously, we went through it all with Rodgers, and the fact that Liverpool had a transfer committee, which was nothing radical whatsoever, but seemed to be in the papers every single week for a number of years. And there was some very clear disagreements between him and the transfer committee on who we should sign. And at the worst stage of that, I think you saw players being signed that were so far away from the proposed style that Rodgers apparently wanted to play with us. So, for example, I'm thinking of Ricky Lambert, Balotelli, thinking of Christian Benteke coming in as almost allegedly a condition of signing Roberto Firmino, who then got barely played at all and was often put on the right wing. All these signs of dysfunction, and then I think when Klopp was appointed, before there was anything won, before there was any sort of glorious evening or anything like that, I do have to admit the overriding feeling from me was just relief that it seemed like, well, at least everybody will just do their jobs, and there's no one going to be fighting or squabbling about something. Just good, that's just a very basic thing. And at that stage, it obviously took a while for things to fall into place, but it just felt good that there was that element had been removed. So I can imagine, the lightning rod of Ed Woodward, other figures as well, even some of the players as well. I was struck by a quote that Rangnick apparently said in the press conference ahead of tomorrow's game, rather, where it's speaking about Liverpool, and he's saying it's no coincidence almost talking to your point, actually, of just being a very cold diagnosis. It's no coincidence what has happened. They brought in the right players and got rid of the right players, and that's why they are where they are.
It sounds simple, doesn't it? But I mean, it's really hard. But I think
it's very hard. Yeah.
I think the key point from what you were saying about where Liverpool used to be was that FSG came in, and I think they made some mistakes initially.
They did.
But they relatively quickly they learned from those mistakes and made the changes that have led to the success you've got now. Whereas United, I think there was too much ego at United to actually recognise that they were making mistakes,
right? And
they didn't know best. And I think that was a huge part of it. The people talk about money and the Glazers and the amount of money that goes out of United, and all of those things are very important arguments against their ownership. But the reason United are where they are now, despite the fact they have actually spent an absolute fortune in the last 7 or 8 years, is because the expertise was never put in place to actually spend that money, well. And I think while Woodward was there was never going to be that moment of realization that what was the way things were at that time was wrong. And I honestly don't think he'd even say he'd done badly now, if I'm honest.
No.
Whereas there does seem to have been some realization somewhere, possibly with him moving on. I think the Super League thing was a big blow to his ego as well, and his reputation in general. And I think there was a bit of a sea change at United at that point that we've really screwed up here, and we need to do something to change all of this around and try and rescue things. But whether that works or not is anybody's guess. I guess the proof will be in the pudding this summer.
Yeah, it's sort of churlish. I mean, I feel like with everything that we've discussed, I mean, there's hope that in some of those positions above the manager that things are now in their right place and will start to improve in terms of having football people in the correct places and a longer term vision for the style of football, the type of club that they want to rebuild at United. But Erik Ten Hag, as the coach coming in, as you mentioned, a very, very particular way of playing, a very particular setup that he's been building within, as has often been the case at Ajax. So their setup and the way in which different coaches have come in succeeded very well, maybe gone on and not succeeded outside of that particular setup. But everything seems to suggest that it's an incredibly well-run club with probably that point about coherence, everybody on the same page really around sort of what they would like the club to be, how they would like their teams to play, and he certainly embodies that as well. And so you'd hope that somebody like him, who seems like a sensible man, has only agreed to come in here if he's been given some certain particular assurances. And I think there is it's been publicised in terms of sort of him having the final decision on transfers, of course, which will probably give him the control to shape and build the squad that he wants to build. But as you said, if things don't immediately go right, will he be given the appropriate time? You'd like to think that he would be. Obviously, I'd like to think that he won't be. But I think that if you're going to appoint a long-term vision manager to build something, he very much fits that mold. And as you mentioned, he's not a coach that has, maybe his career is slightly on the wane at this point. He is still on the up. Just wanted your thoughts on that appointment. He's a very particular character, Erik Ten Hag. And were there any other names that you were still interested in around sort of United appointing as manager? Obviously, Pochettino was floating around there, despite sort of where he currently is with PSG. Just your thoughts on the appointment of that particular manager, and so sort of what you hope it suggests about the direction of the club.
I think when Solskjaer initially gone and Conte was free, I was quite strongly against Conte, not because he's a great manager, but because I think all we've been yearning for at United now is some kind of some sort of strategic vision going forward, rather than just appointing a manager who might be able to get a bit more out of the group of players you've already got. And so from that perspective, I was always quite keen on Ten Hag coming in, even over Pochettino, because whilst I think Pochettino's got that that knowledge of the Premier League, and he's also, I think, more of a personality than Ten Hag is. I don't think he would have provided such a sort of definitive strategic vision on the pitch of going forward. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Ten Hag's been appointed now, because he's very much a guy who's had to work with young players at Ajax, and United have got an inordinately strong group of academy players from really sort of 17 to 19. That's sort of the strongest group I can remember in 30 years. And they've got through to the Youth Cup final, and there are probably 7 or 8 players at the club in that sort of age bracket that I think have got a chance individually that could be good enough to make some degree of first team impact in the next few years. And whilst I'm realistic that probably the likelihood is that the majority of them won't, we've got a manager in who is more suited to realizing that talent. If United can't spend money properly, then they need to make the most of the academy they've got. And if pretty much the only thing that's functioned at a high level in the last few years is the academy and recruitment there, and that was largely as a result of John Murtaugh, and to a lesser degree Nicky Butt. So that both kind of gives me some hope that Murtaugh will be equally as effective as recruitment at a senior level, but also that even if we say sign 4 or 5 players this summer, that there is other talent there that's coming through the academy that's possibly a couple are out on loan now at the moment, guys like Garner and Ethan Laird of Bournemouth, and who I think have got a chance at senior level. The one benefit one good thing that United have, and Erik Ten Hag has when he comes through, is the strength of the academy at the moment. And if the things in the transfer market don't go quite as we hope they do, he's got something to fall back on. And fans love to see academy products come through, and I think they've also got a lot more patience with the manager that gives them a chance. And they've also got more patience with them as players. I think one of the things that's happened at United in recent years is the degree of the pressure that's been on the senior players has really dragged them down. Like Elanga now in the first team, who I don't think has been impacted by that pressure in the same way that a lot of the first team players have, because it's not directed at him. Everyone's still supportive of him, even if they're very down on quite a lot of the other members of the team. So I think that does provide a route both for Ten Hag to sort of strengthen his hand going forward, and also in terms of giving us fans a bit more patience with what he's trying to do.
No, I think so. I think you mentioned there some of the senior players and sort of anger directed at some of those this season. It feels like it was just another ingredient that was added into sort of a situation that was already pretty difficult. As you mentioned, players who were disillusioned in the dressing room because they weren't getting the playing time that they'd maybe been promised by the previous coach or hoped for. Other players not equipped at playing a particular style, for example. Players who maybe wanted away for a while and didn't get their move. I think there's a combination of those. There's been a suggestion of cliques and things at times as well. And a couple of players who I wanted to just to zero in on a second was, first of all, Marcus Rashford. And just obviously he had that time out of the team, recovering from his injury, and then his reintegration into the team. He's an interesting one to me, as I think he's a really good example of one of these young players who came into the first team around some very particular set of circumstances. Clearly has a lot of talent, but to me is a very good example of a player who has been through a number of different coaches and hasn't had any sort of consistency in his development over the past number of years. But just I'd be interested in sort of your opinion on whether or not it's too late for him in terms of too late at United, or whether you think that Erik Ten Hag will sort of be able to give him some consistency that he's been sort of really sort of, I think, desperate for. And the other player is Harry Maguire, like you mentioned, who excels in a very particular set of circumstances and has been asked to do stuff that I don't think he's that comfortable with at all this season. Also looks to have sort of suffered psychologically from the impact of Ronaldo's arrival and sort of the size of that figure in the dressing room as well. Very used to seeing a centre-back being dragged out wide and struggling, because I watched Dejan Lovren for many years as we moved to a more expensive system under Klopp. So I am aware of what it looked like and sort of the frustration that could be directed at those kind of players. But yeah, I think those are two that I find really curious at the moment.
I think that they're both at different points of what I kind of like to call the cycle of the life of a player at United, which is usually they come in, they offer a lot of promise. Recruitment as a whole isn't good enough, so results can't possibly meet expectation, and essentially over a significant period of time they just get dragged under by the degree of pressure and the fact that the team can never get the results that people are expecting of it. I think Rashford's is even more complex in that he was United's best player for the first 18 months or so under Solskjaer, but because Solskjaer was always under enormous pressure, and was never in a good enough run of form that he could afford to rest Rashford or to allow him some time out. We got to the situation where United basically played Rashford for months with a double spine fracture, which seems pretty incredible now, but that happened. And then later with a quite a serious shoulder injury that he just carried for however long. I think on top of those issues, when he finally did have to stop and have those operations and rest or whatever else, I think that was kind of the time when he started, doing his kind of social work, so to speak, and focusing on things like the school meals and everything else. And I also think that he's a guy who has been deeply affected by the reaction to the things he was doing on social media in particular. And social media, particularly things like Twitter at the best of times is a bit of a cesspit, and I think he is basically a really nice kid, a really nice guy, and the amount of hatred and abuse he was exposed to on social media when he was simply trying to do something good. I think that was possibly something that he's actually struggled to deal with. And then there was the racial abuse that he and a couple of others got after the Euros as well.
Yeah.
And I think just a lot of things have come together too. And obviously he was still injured at that point, so he wasn't fit to sort of start the season. And I think all of those things have come together to really impact his confidence and his happiness. Other than just the fact that United drags players under. And I think he's been in such a low place that, whenever he's come on and he's been asked to do a role, or he's started a few games under Rangnick, he's just been anonymous. He's not even been doing the basics, running down blind alleys and hiding from making terrible decisions on the ball, and you can see he's just completely and utterly shot. And so I think Rangnick has tried to, he couldn't pick him just on a performance basis, but I also think he's tried to kind of keep him out of the firing line a bit. But United are at a crossroads with an awful lot of players, because we've got 6 contracts that are up this summer. And I think you're probably going to see, including sort of more peripheral players, you're probably going to see 14 or 15 players leave this summer, which seems incredible, but I think it's the case, and I don't think it's something United can get away from. And then you've got a core as well of guys like Shaw and Rashford and Fred as well, who their contracts are up in 2023. And both they and United need to make a decision on where they're going to go from here. And on performance, you can't really say that they deserve new contracts now, but can United also afford to write them off and move them on when there's going to be such an enormous amount of flux in the squad this summer anyway? So I think Erik Ten Hag is going to have to try and revitalise Rashford, and I think it's the case that if Ten Hag can get United actually playing some decent football and winning some matches, I think an awful lot can change for an awful lot of players. I think the weight of that lack of confidence is enormous, and I think as fans sometimes we underestimate the drag that confidence can bring on a team. I mean, as you saw with Liverpool last year, even with the injuries, once that confidence hits, players that have been doing great things just instinctively for a couple of years suddenly are overthinking the basics.
Exactly. Yeah. If a manager like Klopp as well can't help you overcome that in the short term, it's
I mean, his Dortmund team in his final season had the yips as well, didn't they? They were getting into sort of the final three or 4 months of the season. They were the bottom 3 in the Bundesliga, which is incredible for a side that been in the European final and had won the title. And that just shows you the degree to which confidence can drag players down. But by the same token, if a manager can restore those confidence levels, then a lot can change in a positive sense as well. I think part of perhaps Erik Ten Hag's biggest initial job will be to take the players that are left in the first team squad and actually rebuild them mentally, because I think they are just all utterly broken. And if you can do that, I mean, I can see Rashford being a really important player again. I think he's a player that will fit well, or an on-form Rashford fits well into a Ten Hag system. He loves his inverted wide players. And Rashford showed under Solskjaer that he can very much do that role and be very productive when he's in form. So I think the next 12 months will be really significant for him and for a few others if Ten Hag feels he can kind of restore them to their past best, then there's definitely a place for them. I think at the end of 12 months, if he can't, then I can't really see any point in him retaining players like Rashford. And from the players' perspective as well, so many players at United are utterly miserable. I mean, you can see they're all absolutely miserable at playing football for United. And it's not United per se, it's just the fact that the whole place the situation just drags players under. And you get to the point, and ultimately the fans become incredibly frustrated as well and get on the players' backs. And you're seeing that with guys like Maguire and Pogba and Rashford to a degree, and a few others as well. Once that happens, how do you? It must be incredibly hard as a player to have to face going out and trying to perform in that environment where, this weekend United fans were singing "You're Not Fit to Wear the Shirt" for about 10 minutes and booing their own substitutes. Wow. Or booing the players going off. I think that's the point. That's where it's got to with a lot of the players. And you can see that a lot of them literally are hating stepping on a football pitch for United. And you've got someone like Anthony Martial, who was incredible promise, but he's 5 years into that cycle now, and he's at the point where he literally doesn't want to step on the pitch for United. He just had to get away. And I think that there will be quite a few others who also fit that. So all I can say is that Erik Ten Hag has got one hell of a job. The only plus for him is that the reality is that an enormous number of players are going to move on this summer. Some of them are out of United's control, and others, they're so absolutely intent on getting away that it would be absolutely suicide to keep them.
No.
So he is going to have quite a high degree, an unprecedented degree of churn, I think, really, in terms of players out this summer. And there should be a lot of space on the wage bill for him to bring in players that better suit his preferred style, and also who aren't infected by the abject misery that is United at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a bad person, I would really sort of like pour the salt on at this point or whatever. But no, it seemed like a situation where, as you said, just everybody involved, from the fans to the coaches to the players, certainly, just thoroughly unhappy, just burnt out, thoroughly unhappy.
United hate itself at the moment. I mean, that is what it is. The players, the fans, everyone except probably the Glazers. Everyone at United hates themselves and hates everything to do with United. Yeah. It's really sad to say, but it is what it is.
I suppose,
and you just have to think. So I was going to say, you just have to think that it's the cycle of football, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's the cycle of football. We had 25 years of ridiculous, unprecedented success. So this is just the cycle of football bringing us back down to earth again. So.
No, of course, and it again just feels churlish to almost sort of end it on these points. But around the remaining games of the season, obviously United currently in 5th place. No one seems to want top 4 at the moment. Both Tottenham and Arsenal doing their best to throw away any leverage they had on that position. 54 points, United, so three behind Spurs on the same number of games played at the moment. And just looking at the fixtures around Liverpool, so Liverpool next, Arsenal, Chelsea, Brentford, Brighton, and Palace to end the season. Given where you're suggesting the psyche is at the moment, it doesn't sound like it's in a great place to necessarily grasp that opportunity either. But just your thoughts on sort of what you're expecting, if anything, for the remainder of the season, but then also. I mean, given all that, given the players that are missing as well, and the 5 first-team players missing as well, or likely to be missing for the Liverpool game, I mean, how do you approach that if you're Ralf Rangnick?
I think he's done what he does, which is say as it is. He's been asked questions about top 4, and he said there's no point even talking about it because we're that bad. Essentially, you're paraphrasing. There's no point in talking about it because we're that bad, particularly defensively. It's not going to happen. And I think he's absolutely right, to be honest. We've got, I think, again, on performance, as we saw against Norwich at the weekend, on overall performance, United are back to a point where I'd say they're probably in bottom 6 in terms of in terms of the actual coherence of the performances they're putting in terms of the defending, in terms of creativity, it's all, arse end of the Premiership stuff. It really is that bad. And so I think he's looking at the next three against Liverpool and Arsenal away and Chelsea at home, thinking we'll be lucky if we get a point out of those. And I think he's probably right. And then, Brentford at home's one. I mean, to be honest, absolutely everybody at the club wants the season to be over. And the next 6 games are just going to be some awful purgatory until we can all just stop thinking about it and everyone can go on their holidays and we can purge half the squad and try and move on. And I think the results are probably going to end up showing that essentially everyone's just wanting it to be over. And I think starting tomorrow night, I'd be very surprised. I wouldn't be remotely surprised if we saw something similar to the game at Old Trafford, because we cannot defend and we can't keep the ball either, actually. And I think Liverpool are almost certainly on form the best team in Europe by a reasonable distance at the moment, and you're incredibly efficient. I mean, that's one of the things that has been most notable about Liverpool. You've got incredibly efficient players, and I don't think you'd even need to be playing particularly well to give United a stuffing tomorrow. I hate to say, but it is what it is. You've got one team that's essentially going for a quadruple, that's really incredibly focused, sort of it's playing its best football, and you've got another one who really just doesn't want to be there and would quite happily have the season end tomorrow. And I think what you're going to see probably represents that.
Right, well, I'm not sure. Sort of, given this is going to a Liverpool audience, I'm not sure I could have recorded I'm sure more pleasurable podcast for them. I'm sure, but it certainly sounds as though the situation, and I know this from having sort of a number of good friends who support United. It's currently, it does feel as though the worst of all possible situations, and as you mentioned, just almost hoping to close your eyes, wake up, it's the summer, and you can begin to rebuild.
Football's about Schadenfreude, isn't it?
It is. I'm trying very hard.
We wouldn't enjoy our own good times if we didn't have others' bad times to crow about as well. That's just football, isn't it? So I'm talking about the cycle of football. We got to laugh at Liverpool for nearly 30 years. And it's our turn. It's just our turn. That's where we are. And I think I'm getting old and a bit pragmatic in my view to football. I actually, it sounds insane, but I do actually enjoy watching Liverpool play. I haven't enjoyed watching United for quite a long time. It's one of those things you do because they're your club, and you support them, and you do in good or bad times. But I've had to look elsewhere to actually see some decent football, and I enjoy the Champions League when we're not in it, because it's kind of a standard of football and a quality that you just don't see when you're watching United. And Liverpool are a great team. I can remember having a brief Twitter conversation with you about Luis Diaz when you signed him, and Luis Diaz he was absolutely fantastic at Porto, really, really, really good, and it's just the kind of signing that Liverpool make that United don't. 30, whatever it was, 35 million.
Yeah, 37 or something.
For a guy who was already playing at a world class level that was the perfect Klopp player. He was already everything that Klopp needed in a player, in a forward. And you've just got a great manager doing things near perfectly. It is what it is, and you are an incredibly high level and impressive team to watch. So I can't, United aren't, Liverpool are at the moment. I'm sure one day it'll be different. So I've just got to suck it up.
Yeah, I'm also not going to continue this any longer. I think that's probably sort of the perfect place to wrap things up. With those very magnanimous words around Liverpool at the moment. And I think for myself, it's just been about constantly making sure I'm putting things into perspective actually, and enjoying this as much as I should be. I think because I think it must be very easy to fall into the fact. I mean, for example, with the Champions League, like qualification for the semi-finals, I know that there have been some draws that have been kind to us as well, but the fact that felt relatively routine is, I think, it's probably just an indication of how well run and how well everything's going at the moment. As is the fact that, this quadruple everybody likes to go on about is still theoretically possible, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, Rich, thank you so much for all the insight there on Man United. I hope it was somewhat cathartic because it sounds like that everyone's been going through it.
No, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And but before we do wrap things up completely, just wanted to tell all the listeners who've been tuning in to Rival Recon this season, obviously as the games get no less important, which is always a very useful thing when you're doing a show like this, there'll be another podcast ahead of the game against Everton, Merseyside derby, who I'm sure you're all very much looking forward to. Liverpool adding to Frank Lampard's misery, if we can. And then, of course, there'll be another one ahead of the Newcastle game on the 30th of April as well, so do tune in then. But in the meantime, plenty to be excited about, plenty of games coming thick and fast, so do tune in to all the other great content on Anfield Index Pro. Otherwise, we'll speak to you after the United game and ahead of that game against our neighbours in Merseyside on the weekend. So, see you all then.
We hope you enjoyed listening to this Anfield Index show. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel so future podcasts find their way to your device automatically. There's nothing quite like fan engagement, and we'd love to know what you think of anything discussed on this show. The best way to get in touch is over on our free Discord community, where both podcasters and listeners debate the hottest LFC topics 24/7. Sign up free now at AnfieldIndex.com/Discord. You won't regret it. You can also follow us on Twitter at Anfield Index and find us on Facebook by searching for Anfield Index. Oh, and before you go, we'd love it if you could leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app. It only takes a couple of seconds, and it means the world to the people who create these free shows.